Very much appreciate the invitation this morning to talk to the conference and to try and look at the positives of the pandemic and some more Ironbridge specific examples, which are the flooding that we experienced at Ironbridge. It's probably not the easiest task. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Nick Ralls, I'm the CEO of Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust, and it was my pleasure, I think, when I started on the 2nd of December 2019, probably naively and optimistically looking to a bright future, which changed very dramatically. Previously, it's been said I've worked in the National Trust and the Birmingham Museums before going over to the dark side or the wilderness years working at Heritage Railway for a few years before I came back to museums. So I want to just look at flooding in the gorge and some of the experiences and learnings from an Ironbridge perspective, and how we dealt with the challenges of this disaster of a more watery kind. I also want to finish by summarising what I felt we did well and perhaps not so well, and lastly where we are now and what we think the future holds. So let's start with flooding. Many of you, if not all of you, will know that the museum at Ironbridge is set in a World Heritage Site. Yes, we're already there. We've got that World Heritage Site status. And its monuments and museums are left from the birthplace of industrialisation in the UK in the 18th century, when the Derby's experimented with coal, more precisely coke, as a fuel to produce mass-produced cast iron. So some 300 years later, it's somewhat ironic that due to industrialisation and the byproducts of industrial processes and pollution, that flooding is proving a problem in the gorge. Flooding is nothing new, because at this point, as you enter the gorge, the wide and meandering River Severn is bottlenecked through a tight valley side, and that causes flooding. However, it's the frequency of the flooding and the height at which it reaches that is becoming a big issue for the museum. And it's very much a story about people. We're a museum, but we're surrounded by a community, and the challenge for them is greater because they're having to move out of their homes and the damage that's caused for their homes. But many businesses, many organisations in the gorge are affected, and particularly at Ironbridge, it's the two museums right next to the Severn. So the Museum of the Gorge and Corporate China Museum. So the river that once provided a transport link to the world is now becoming a danger. And as way of a demonstration, the next slide hopefully will show you how incredible that rise is. So here you can see the Museum of the Gorge on the right-hand side on a normal sunny day, where the river range is usually between 0.42 and 3.4 metres. So in 2021, the river was at 6.6 metres during February half term, having reached the similar levels in both 2020 now and 2021 and now 2022. And why does it always have to be February half term? So what does this do? Well, it has an immediate impact on the museum. So both the Museum of the Gorge and Corporate China Museum are inundated. So we do have, like every museum, emergency protocols, which are very warm now. We know our way around these. So we know that if we get a 24-hour warning that we need to empty objects and fittings from the two museums. So however, whilst all the other museums are well away from the water's edge, they are in effect closed because of the red weather warnings that the Environment Agency quite rightly put out that the roads are closed and there's a risk to life. And quite helpful, well not very helpfully this year, it was even advertised on the M6 and M5 saying stay away. So there is then a legacy because the museums affected have to dry out. That takes about 2 weeks before all of the river silt dries out, and then we have to have specialist firms in to remove that, and then we have to clean the museums again. So each time this is happening, it's costing around £5,000 which in itself doesn't sound a lot, but it's the stay away message that really does affect us, because the visitors to our other museums do not come. So in effect, it closes the museums for a week to 2 weeks. And you can imagine the revenue loss of those 2 weeks is quite severe. So whilst our insurance broker is very understanding, obtaining flood insurance now for these buildings is difficult, if not impossible. And we have found a way around it through a company called Flood Flash, which puts these basically tubes on the wall of the building, and once it tops that, it automatically pays out. But it's getting to the point now where it's going so high up the building, you might as well not have it, because of the irregularity of the flooding we do have. It does mean that we have to seriously consider the use or mitigations for the protection of those buildings, and we want to redevelop the Museum of the Gorge as a World Heritage Site Visitor Centre for Ironbridge and a community centre in the evening. However, the design now has got to consider that the interior of the building has got to be either completely demountable or waterproof. And finally, we've got a budget for potentially losing 2 to 3 weeks of every year due to flooding. I've got a disclaimer here before we go into COVID, the COVID caveat, because I'm just very aware that the pandemic, as previous speakers have said, it has affected us all, and it's affected us all quite profoundly, both as organisations and individually. And the experiences, sacrifices and challenges that we've all faced are unique, and we've all responded differently. So the decisions that I'm going to talk about at Ironbridge are no better or worse than any other organisation. And I'm sure that I already know that some of the things that I'm going to talk about are shared, and my decisions are not exemplar, they're just decisions that were taken over the last couple of years. So when we moved into 2020, I think all the dates of each lockdown are probably seared into your memory because we've all gone through the same process. But I mean, how did we respond at Ironbridge? Well, when the news came quite suddenly between January and February into March, we activated our emergency plan that we have, but the emergency plan, who had an emergency plan that said that the museum was going to be open, or sorry, closed, then perhaps open again, then closed again for a period of the next 2 years. So our situation, I think, was probably a little bit more critical because we'd already experienced the flooding in February 2020, which had affected our finances before we went into COVID. So what did we do? We moved into a period of writing a convincing and compelling financial plan about how we were going to survive. And there is no doubt as well, I think, being a World Heritage Site did help. It was a factor in securing funding in the future. So our immediate priority was to recast the budget with very little practical information to hand, do a new 3-year plan, put together detailing 20 with an outline of 21 and 22. When we believed, again naively, that the challenges of COVID would be over in about 6 to 12 months. And that hasn't obviously proved to happen. And our response was based on the following model, looking at cost savings, looking at our biggest overheads, looking at projects that would improve the offer when we reopened, a review of the opening regime, which we undertook with some detail, which revealed that the cost of moving to a seasonal opening model doesn't really work because of the high costs of maintaining museums over a number of museums and a number of monuments. So there was all that cost, that underlying cost was baked into our budgets, and there's not a lot we could do about that. There was a plan to increase our volunteer use and a governance review that had already just started, which has resulted in the significant input of new trustees and advisors at Ironbridge with fresh attitudes and fresh ideas, which has been really helpful over the last couple of years. We obviously had welcome support as well. And the announcement of the furlough scheme was a game changer for us. And we also lobbied, like probably everybody did in the room, increased the lobbying of our two MPs, Philip Dunn and Bruce Yellen. So through the MPs and concern, we did set up monthly meetings with DCMS officers and representatives from the Arts Council and Historic England, which proved to be very, very useful. We also found that we managed to secure some initial funding from our local council, which is Telford and Reekie, which acted as felt like a door knocking. Once that funding was in, suddenly everybody else started to believe that Ironbridge could move forward and that it started to change. And that self-belief in the organisation, our belief in ourselves, and a belief that we had a future was much more powerful. All the agencies we involved with were very responsive, and we had funding already available, already open for projects, and there was a high degree of adaptation that was allowed in terms of how we use that funding. And it's no doubt, without the support of those institutions and Historic England listed there, our situation now would be perhaps a lot more dicey than it is, and we look positively to the future. You've always got to have a bit of luck. Agility has been mentioned here about a number of times already about how that single-minded focus that everybody had over those 2 years, that ability to concentrate on one or two items and move them forward, whether it's IT or strategic planning. We were able to achieve things very quickly that we weren't able to do before. We also made a commitment, as lockdown fluctuated, and it did several times, that we were determined to open as quickly as we could within restrictions and adapt on the hoof and adapt to the regional changes, that tiered system that changed from day to day. And I remember, I think it was the Christmas in 2020, where I think we delivered our last Christmas weekend the day before lockdown came back in full force. CRF1 and CRF2 were absolutely fantastic in supporting the cost of the organisation and providing us to undertake some projects that improved the visitor offer when we reopened. And while we were doing this, we also funded a project to open a new playground at Bliss Hill, and that was delivered within 12 months from concept through to building. Now, a playground, you think of a municipal playground. What we've done, hopefully you'll be able to see that it isn't a municipal playground. It's a purpose-built attraction in woodland at Bliss Hill. It doesn't take away from the Victorian town. It's within the woodland. You can't see it from the Victorian town, but it's a fantastic purpose-built designed project that has made a real difference to the visitor offer when we were open. So looking back from the position of 2022, I think all of our team would say that we're pleased in terms of we believe that we've built the faith in Ironbridge, that we have got a strong future. But the trading conditions that we predicted in January 2022 when we were budgeting are perhaps, well, they are very different from the reality that we're experiencing now. And it's a reminder that we are still in a period of constant instability that we've all experienced since March 2020, and it continues, and we're not in the clear yet. Fatigue and stress have already been mentioned. Fatigue is an issue, and in terms of operating within a smaller team who have worked through COVID and are still recovering and are still facing the challenges day to day now. And I think for Ironbridge there's been almost a bit of corporate amnesia to come over, because we have had long periods of being closed where maintenance hasn't been taken part, or there's been degradation over 2 years. So our backlog of repairs and renewals to catch up has been significant. And I think we do all agree that the changes that we've undergone have been profound, and now they're permanent, and that we're all different, and all of those changes are now the new norms. And the positives that we have to take are, in particular, that agility, the importance of reacting swiftly, the networks that we've all built up and using those perhaps more on a day-to-day level than we did before. And that in our staff, there are people that have really stepped forward over the last 2 years. And it has been a massive team effort at Ironbridge. But there are individuals that have come forward and really shown the big stars and shown how important they are to the organisation. And of course, at Ironbridge, those relationships that hopefully we've fostered, we want to continue with all of the agencies and DCMS. So, looking forward, and trying to look positively for what has the global pandemic done for Ironbridge, I think the sector support has absolutely been brilliant. It's been the most helpful. And the exposure to officers, councils, MPs, I think it's been said before, it reminds all of us of the importance of the cultural sector to the economy of the UK. And the recent packages that have been announced and have been available to address some of the issues derived from COVID, such as our backlog of maintenance. So that's been supported through a recent application to the National Heritage Memorial Fund and the Arts Council Men Fund. It's making a huge difference. So we've secured funding to overcome those COVID issues, and that's some £11 million. So we approach 22 to 23 with confidence and with gratitude for all of the sector support that we've had. And at Ironbridge, I'm hugely proud of the resilience of our teams. But I feel perhaps there's we must be very pragmatic still, because there's still many challenges that we've got to overcome in 22 and 23. Thank you very much.